Okay, we are on page 13 of our Learning to Pray Like the Psalmist lesson. Andrew, and it sounds like Ezra too, got a pretty bad stomach bug. So he asked me to fill in for him tonight. So I also have Andrew's notes, and I'm going to try to keep it relatively in the direction that he wanted, since he's teaching for the next couple weeks. Okay, so if you remember, just in way of recap, what we've covered in this lesson so far is seeing ourselves as the psalmist did. So we began with the discussion of seeing ourselves like sheep, which is not something that usually, especially I would say in this country it seems, people want to say about themselves. But the fact is, as we went through it, we are sheep. And we have to acknowledge that. And as we said, there are some desirable and some undesirable things about being sheep, elements to that, but we need to come to terms with it. And this is a question for all of you to sort of reflect on the material that we went through. So if you had to summarize the importance of admitting that we are sheep, what would you say the importance of that is? Why is that so important? What does that say about us? In just like one sentence or one phrase. Why is it so important to admit that we're sheep?
Because it says that we have God as our shepherd.
Okay, well, Samantha and then Margaret.
Because it's humbling.
Humbling? Okay. Samantha says humbling. Would you say, Margaret?
I said it says that we have God as our shepherd.
Okay. And so what I see in both of those is that there is a need. And so what I had put for that is when we admit that we're sheep, we admit that we need God. And we can't do it by ourselves. We need someone to lead us. We need someone to take care of us. And really that is something that every human being has to do at some point or another, is admit, I can't do this on my own. And there's more to just me trying to have a good life. I need God. And part of that is what we're looking at with the psalmists, because they understood that. And so what we're going to cover tonight then is looking at this idea of we are sinners in need of mercy. And if I didn't say, if anybody needs a book, there should be a couple there on the back table here in the auditorium. But we are sinners in need of mercy. We need God. So let's turn to Psalm 38 first, and we'll look at this question number 6. Psalm 38. Do I have a volunteer to read this first one? It looks like Emily is volunteering. Can we read 3 through 4? 38, 3 through 4.
Hold on, I was in 68. There is no soundness in my flesh because of your indignation. There is no health in my bones because of my sin. For my iniquities have gone over my head. Like a heavy burden, they are too heavy for me.
Okay. Now, we're asked a question about this, and it might be difficult. I don't know. It took me a second to think about it. But from these verses here, or maybe if you want to pull in the fuller context, what did the psalmist say about himself and his sins in those verses? What do those verses say about the psalmist and his sins? I think there's probably a couple things. Emily?
I think part of it is that it's like throughout all of him. Like all of him is corrupt. It's throughout all of his bones.
Okay. So you said that because of the talking about the flesh and the bones. So these are deep-seated things. What else does it say about him and his sins? Okay, so if we look at what Emily pointed us to, for instance, there's no soundness in my flesh because of your indignation. There's no health in my bones because of my sin. And we remember that what the Psalms usually do is they say things in parallel. So getting at the same thing but saying it two different ways. And what Emily was talking about is that this is all throughout him. And if we look at what the psalmist is pointing us to, his flesh is destroyed. There's no health in his bones. It's debilitating. So I said, for instance, that his sins are destroying him. It's affecting his bones. It's affecting his flesh. It's debilitating, like Samantha says. And not just only are they affecting all of him, but there's something else too. I think specifically in verse 4. What is verse 4 telling us?
They're overwhelming.
Absolutely overwhelming. They are too much to bear. He says they've gone over my head. They're too heavy for me to carry. And so the psalmist says about himself and his sins that they're destroying him and they're too much for him to handle. You can already see the direction that we're going with that and what we talked about and the importance of us saying that we're sheep. Did anybody else have anything that they wanted to make sure to say for number 6? Okay. So number 7 is talking about Paul's assertion of our sinfulness in Romans chapter 3. So let's turn over there for a second, and I'll read this so that we're reminded of what Paul is saying, and then I'm going to ask for volunteers to go to each of these psalm references. So Romans chapter 3, and I believe the author was trying to say 10 through 18 because that's the whole of the quotation. So if we start in verse 9, Paul says, "What then? Are we better than they? Not at all, for we have already charged that both Jews and Greeks are all under sin. As it is written, there is no righteous person, not even one. There is no one who understands. There is no one who seeks out God. They have all turned aside. Together they have become corrupt. There is no one who does good. There is not even one. Their throat is an open grave. With their tongues they keep deceiving. The venom of asps is under their lips. Their mouth is full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Destruction and misery are in their paths, and they have not known the way of peace. There is no fear of God before their eyes." And so in that, what is pointed out for us is that there's 6 quotations from different psalms here. So Paul has kind of, you could say, put down like a representative sample of what the psalms have to say about this and put it together here. And I believe we would all understand that what Paul is doing in that chapter, as he said at the end of verse 9, we have already charged that both Jews and Greeks are all under sin. We are all sinful. So now let's look individually at these psalms here. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I need 5 volunteers. Raise your hand if you'd be willing to read. And if not, I will assign. So we got Josh. Salem is going to do it too. Daniel. And I need 2 more. John and Alicia. Okay, so Josh, will you take the Psalm 14, 1 through 3? Salem, Psalm 5:9. Daniel, Psalm 143. John, Psalm 10:7. And Alicia, Psalm 36:1. So I'll have them read those in a minute. But before we do that, I want to ask a couple extra questions. So these passages we're all looking at here are about our sinfulness, as we just talked about. Have you ever noticed that we tend to get uncomfortable when we talk about our sinfulness? Or if you've spent much time in the larger religious world, you'll notice that there's sometimes a resistance to talking about the sinfulness of people. Am I the only one that's ever noticed that? I'm getting nothing from you guys. If you look at it, you talk to people, and I would say especially those who would be labeled as liberal theologically, there's a resistance in saying that people are bad. And I don't know if that's just a humanistic thing of we want to see ourselves as good and useful. Of course, this is in our culture, but there's a resistance to that, to acknowledging our sinfulness. And I think we all would understand that it's a little bit uncomfortable. And Andrew asked the question, I think it's a good one. In looking at all of these Psalms, is this advocating self-hatred? When we look at all of these and we go through and see the things that it says about our sinfulness, do you think that this is advocating a self-hatred?
The psalmist is advocating self-evaluation. If you want to say being real with yourself, being honest with yourself. I can see myself in every one of these, even though I don't consider myself a very good liar. But lies can be told by the way you conduct yourself. Lies can be told to yourself instead of other people. There are ways that we deceive ourselves into thinking that our sins are not as bad as other people's sins. I think there's a lot of ways that we can appreciate some of these words that don't paint us out to be some sort of thug or some sort of, malcontent or misadjusted in society. When if you really get down to it, a lot of this stuff was about the deceitfulness of oneself. And I think it's really hard to be honest with myself.
Yeah. So I think that point of driving toward self-evaluation is really important. That we're supposed to look at ourselves, and this is not just so that we can hate who we are. This is to get a more realistic picture of who we actually are as human beings. And I think the other thing that we should point out too is that to a certain degree with a lot of these, this is stated in hyperbolic poetry. So it's not to say that every single thing in you as a human being is evil. I don't think that's true. There's a mix of good and there's a mix of bad. But I think the bad ultimately in the cosmic scheme has outweighed the good. But this is looking at yourself, trying to get a more realistic picture and evaluate and see the fact that, maybe some of these particulars I haven't done or I haven't experienced, but as Greg said, I still see myself in every single one of these. So we're not advocating for self-hatred, but we're looking at our sinfulness and trying to get a realistic view of it. And why is it so important to do that? Why is it essential that we look at and understand our sinfulness? Shows how much we need God. That's a huge thing, yeah. Anything else? Why is it so important that we look at and understand our sinfulness? Samantha says it shows that we need God. And that's definitely one thing.
It helps with the compassion whenever we're looking at others.
That would be big too. We're all in the same boat. There's not any one of us who does not fall into this category. John, you had your hand up.
I was going to say, any self-help, with alcohol, drugs, they won't really work with you until the first step is to state your name and to state that you are whatever it is.
Yeah, admitting what you are. Yeah.
Right. So there's really no sense in doing any kind of self-help until you get through past step one. And really that's where this is coming to, where it kind of comes from, really.
Yeah.
It's really a scriptural principle.
Yeah, so the first step to fixing the problem, as we say, is admitting there's a problem. So that's one thing. I think combining all of these, so let's turn to Romans chapter 5 real quick. Romans chapter 5 and verse 10. And this is something I hadn't thought of myself, but as I was going through Andrew's notes, he pointed this out, and I thought that we should definitely spend some time on this. So Romans chapter 5 and verse 10 says, "For if while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of his Son, much more, having been reconciled, we shall be saved by his life." And so the point being there, every single one of us were enemies of God. But what did he do?
He redeemed us.
He still redeemed us. And so one of the things I think is important about doing this, we see ourselves more realistically, we take those steps in being able to fix the problem and all the other things that are said, but also we realize the full scope and appreciate what God has actually done. We see him more clearly for who he is, and the fact that even while we were his enemies, he still did all of these things to reconcile us through the death of his son. And so our appreciation should just push the roof off of our heads. And I think that's one of the big reasons. So let's go and look at all these individually. So Josh, could you read that Psalm 14, 1 through 3?
The fool has said in his heart, "There is no God." They are corrupt. They have committed abominable deeds. There is no one who does good. The Lord has looked down from heaven upon the sons of men to see if there are any who understand, who seek after God. They've all turned aside together and have become corrupt. There is no one who does good, not even one.
Okay, so what does this one say about our sinfulness?
Can you read that last part, Josh? Please, thank you.
Which, the very last verse? Or?
Yes.
Okay. They've all turned aside together. They have become corrupt. There is no one who does good, not even one.
It's basically that all of us sin, I think.
Yeah, that's what I took away from it, is that we have all turned away. We've all been corrupted, as it says. And that's exactly how Paul uses it, is to point out that fact. And one thing I want to talk about, too, is, because we've gone over this psalm a couple times, what does it mean when it says that that person is a fool there in verse 1? What does it mean by saying the fool says that there is no God?
I think there are at least 5 Hebrew words that translate fool. This one is Nabal, and Nabal was the fool who denied the existence of God. He was an active, rebellious voice against the Lord. And so that's different than the naive fool, that's different than the simple fool. This is the one that's taken a position contrary to God.
Yeah, and I don't think it's like a philosophical position either. It is, this person is living, I think what's usually said if you look at this word is, it shows somebody who's deficient morally. They've said there is no God, and I'm going to live that way. And I think that's what you see in Psalm 14. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. They're corrupt. They do abominable deeds. There is no one who does good. And it's not saying that this person is an idiot, they're stupid. They're saying that they're deficient morally. They said, God, there's no God, he doesn't care about what we do, and so I'm going to live that way. And if you look at this, it talks about this fool, but I think if you look at the rest of it, you see kind of the scope widen, where it's talking about the rest of us as well, all the people around. Any other comments on that one? Okay, next one, Psalm 5:9, Selah.
For there is no truth in their mouth, their inmost self is destruction. Their throat is an open grave, they flatter with their tongue.
Okay, so what does that say about human sinfulness?
The only thing I can think of is that, like, people like to be. I know what I'm thinking. I'm just trying to think about it, but people like to be told what they're doing right. That what they're doing is right, even if it's not.
Okay.
I kind of thought of flattery when I heard that.
Yeah, there's definitely, flattering with their tongue, throat in an open grave. What else do we think here? Well, one of the things I took, if you kind of combine all of what's said there in verse 9, no truth, destruction, open grave, flattery, seems to say that there's not really anything good inside them. It's all kind of empty and void. And again, I think this is, I'll say a hyperbole. It's not saying that human beings are entirely, completely, absolutely evil, because we still are image bearers of God. But there's not really anything good there, is I think what that is getting at. Psalm 140:3, that's Daniel.
They make their tongue sharp as a serpent's, and under their lips is the venom of asps.
Okay, so likening us to snakes, what does that say about our sinfulness?
Well, I mean, the serpent deceived, and so maybe deceptive.
Deceptive, okay.
Not all snakes are poisonous, but poisonous snakes, the bite is not just the bite, but it's the after effect. And I think our lies are like that. We tell a lie that's got a certain level of pain, but then it often festers and becomes a bigger issue than even the initial words.
Okay. Yeah. So there's kind of ripple effects there. This one I thought was a little bit harder for me, but I saw with the snakes sharpening their tongues, kind of hiding the venom. It was sort of depicting it as a predatory kind of thing, or looking for an opportunity. I don't know if anybody else saw that, but it's not just the fact that if we're put in a situation we might stumble, but we also look for opportunities to do evil, don't we? I seek that thing out that I know I shouldn't be doing, and I still do it. That is kind of that same way of the snakes. And as Greg was pointing out, another thing is there's effects that come from all of that.
Seems that their whole design that's their avocation.
Their whole nature there, that's what they do. Yeah.
I'm no snake expert, but I've often heard that snakes don't really want to waste their venom because it's a expensive resource for their bodies to generate. Snakes tend to strike when they're left with no other option. And we turn to lies when we feel backed into a corner. So I think it's kind of opportunistic too to say, I didn't mean to tell a lie, but they didn't leave me any choice. It was the only way out of the situation.
Yeah, opportunistic was an exact word that I had. And for me, I think the only good snake is a dead snake. So that's what I have to say. Don't read into that too much. I'm not asking for all of you to die. That was just me staying on my soapbox for a second. Yeah, there's this opportunistic. It's who they are. They're looking for kind of a thing. It's predatory. Next one, Psalm 10:7. Got John. Oh, you're fine.
His mouth is full of cursing and deceit and oppression. Under his tongue is trouble and iniquity.
Okay, so what does this one get at? What is it identifying about sinfulness?
Comes from our mouth.
Comes from our mouths. Yeah, I mean, that was the first thing that hit me as well. There's all kinds of trouble that can happen from our mouths. Other things.
John, can you read that again?
Uh,
Yeah, thank you.
His mouth is full of cursing and deceit and oppression. Under his tongue is trouble and iniquity.
Seems to be like, what I thought of when I read that was it's stuff directed toward others. Maybe that's harmful.
Okay, yeah. We can definitely do that. The harm caused.
See what he's not. I said you see what he's not.
See what he's not? What do you mean by that?
These are all characteristics, and you're not going to see good things come out of this person. So
Okay.
be a person to avoid.
Yeah, that would be a person to avoid. But sadly, the point of all this is this is every one of us, right? I had said that, our words cause all kinds of problems. If we look at some particulars of what it says, under our tongues, our mouths are full of these things, and under our tongue is harm and injustice. I thought that was a good way to wrap up all the problems that come from people's words and what they say to each other. Wars are started over words. If people get killed over words and all kinds of things. And we could go back and look at what Greg led us through in James chapter 3 and all of that, of all of the effects that come from just what we say and what's under our tongues. Okay, and Psalm 36:1, Alicia.
An oracle within my heart concerning the transgression of the wicked. There is no fear of God before his eyes.
Okay. And this one, what does this last one say about sinfulness?
That you don't, that it's all about you, there's no respect at all for any high, you don't even believe in a higher authority, basically.
Yeah, no respect, no fear for God there. Other things? I think if you kind of look at this, especially the first part of verse 1, wrongdoing speaks to the ungodly in his heart, or rebelliousness speaks. It's deep. Rebellion is deep within them. And I was looking at Andrew's notes. He said rebellious to the core. And I thought that was a good way to put that. These things are not just skin deep, as we might say. It's really down to our most core selves that we find a lot of this. And deep down, when we act this way, when we live this way, it shows that we don't really have respect for God as maker and king and all of those things that he is. And again, this is not so that we hate ourselves. This is so that we have a realistic picture of who we are and our limitations, and understand that we need someone. We need God. And one thing I wanted to point out with all this. So when we look at this, there is sometimes the usage of I, but usually it's talking about in terms of they. So why do you think in these Psalms, when we read these things, the psalmist will sometimes say, I do this, they do all these bad things. But then Paul goes ahead and says the they is all of us. And that's a little bit confusing, right? So what do you think Paul's suggesting by assigning us as the they in these passages? Because who are the they? The psalmist is the I, the other people are the they. Who is the they?
Well, usually sometimes that is like wicked or evil, or
Yeah. The wicked, the evil, you might say that in those passages, those are the enemies of God. The psalmist is the righteous, the faithful one. And the they, those people who are doing all these things, are the unfaithful. They're the enemies of God. But Paul says the they applies to all of us. And you look at how he uses these psalms, that's an interesting thing. He kind of plucks them out of a different context, right, if you think about it that way. But he says, no, this is talking about all of humanity here. And that's just underscoring what we had read elsewhere in Romans. We were God's enemies because we chose to do these things. We chose to go a different course. And one of the first steps is that we need to see where we were and see who God is and what he's done to truly appreciate that and to be able to do something different. So as you looked at all of these for number 7, and you're kind of to look at them as a whole picture, what thoughts come up for you as you look at each of these 5 things, these 5 verses? What did it make you think?
Makes me think of the dependency that I have on God to take care of my soul.
Yeah, absolutely. Dependency is a huge thing. What did somebody else think? Emily?
I think it kind of helps us to be conscious of the fact that, like, at the root of it, this is what humanity has become. So the fact that so easily, like, this can become in our heart, in our tongue. And so just remembering how easy of a slope it can be.
Because it didn't start out like that, did it? It started out with us in harmony with God, the way that we are supposed to be created. And we decided to break the relationship. And this is the cause. Or this is the effect, I should say. So one thing said to me, the dependency I definitely thought about, but I also was thinking, when you look at all that, it says there's a real problem here. There is a huge problem. And then I thought, what can I do about it?
Examine myself daily.
Okay, Greg?
Well, that's kind of the point of the Roman letter. There's not a thing you can do about it. There's nothing you can do about it. We are at the mercy of God. We've always been at the mercy of God. And anyone that thought themselves justifying the law was just fooling themselves. And but the writer says that's true of Christians too.
Yeah.
Don't get the impression that we're saving ourselves by being righteous people. Because I'm often righteous when it suits me to be righteous. I'm not always righteous. So I'm guilty of sin that will destroy me forever.
Yeah, absolutely. You look at these Psalms in the context that all of these are plucked out in. The psalmist is always looking for God to step into the picture. Because he realizes there's nothing I can do here. And so we recognize there's this huge problem, and we have this dependency that we should have on God, and what can we do about it? You know, am I just supposed to try harder? Obviously, I have a responsibility, and God expects certain things of me. But even if I just try harder, I'm going to be in the same spot. And so it takes us to the fact that we need help. We need somebody who's more powerful than us to come into the situation. And luckily, God is there, and God is who He is. And He's there to help. So let's look at number 8 here. So we're going to look at these, and it says, according to the psalmist in the following passages, how were they going to be able to overcome their sins? And so we just said that in a different way. You could say that all of these passages are pointing out that there are sins, and what are we supposed to do about them? And so now we're looking at what the psalmists say, the solutions that they were thinking of and meditating on. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Can I get 7 different volunteers? Emily? I'll throw you in later if nobody else. Gavin and Rachel. Margaret. I need 3 more. Greg. 2 more. Taylor. And I'll throw Josh in. Okay, so Emily, will you do Psalm 5, 7 through 8? Gavin, will you do Psalm 23? Rachel, Psalm 25, 4 through 10. Margaret, 26, 12. Greg, 39, 1 through 2. Taylor, 51, 5. And then Josh, 141, 3 through 10. So let's go ahead. Emily, will you start us off?
But I, through the abundance of your steadfast love, will enter your house. I will bow down toward your
Okay. So what was going to be the solution to the sinfulness here?
Can you read that last verse?
Lead me, O Lord, in your righteousness because of my enemies. Make your way straight before me.
So basically, allowing us to be guided by God.
Okay, yeah, allowing. And I had said submission and surrender there. What else? Is there anything else there? Okay, so if we look at this, there's the submission and the surrender. If you look at it, going and bowing in the temple in reverence, allowing God to guide. But there's also, in verse 7, but as for me, by your abundant graciousness, I will enter your house. The only reason I'm even able to come into your presence is by your grace, is what he says there. So there's God's graciousness. There's also his guidance that we're supposed to accept. And we have to, submit and surrender to that. And so that was going to be how the psalmist overcame their sins there. Okay, Gavin, will you do Psalm 23?
Yes, sir. Starting in verse 1. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, and my cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever.
Okay, so I thought this one maybe took a little bit more thinking, perhaps because this is something we're familiar with in a different kind of lens. So what does Psalm 23 say about how the psalmist was going to be able to overcome their sins? Margaret?
I think the first verse says everything. The Lord is my shepherd.
Okay.
And if he is your shepherd, then you're going to follow him. And all of the other things in this psalm will come to pass.
Yeah, absolutely. I had follow the shepherd, but I also had trust him, because you're not going to follow him and allow him to take care of you if you don't trust him. So yeah, following God, trusting him, that was going to be how the psalmists overcame their sins. Okay, and 25, 4 through 10, Rachel.
Make me to know your ways, O Lord. Teach me your paths. Lead me in your truth and teach me. For you are the God of my salvation. For you I wait all the day long. Remember your mercy, O Lord, and your steadfast love, for they have been from of old. Remember not the sins of my youth, or my transgressions. According to your steadfast love, remember me. For the sake of your goodness, O Lord. Good and upright is the Lord. Therefore he instructs sinners in the way. He leads the humble in what is right, and teaches the humble his way. All the paths of the Lord are steadfast love and faithfulness, for those who keep his covenant and his testimonies.
Okay, thank you. So this one's maybe a little bit easier. So what does this one say about being able to overcome sin?
I think it's interesting that the psalmist was asking God to teach them.
Mm-hmm.
Because we can't figure it out, you can't figure it out on your own. And you do have to be taught, basically.
Yeah, and you can still figure out information, but that doesn't mean it's going to do you any good. Okay, so Samantha just talked about the fact that this is asking for God's teaching. So the only way I'm going to be able to get out of anything and understand anything is if God teaches me. But there's also something else, too, if you look at verse 6 and 7. What's the concept there?
God's mercy and
Yeah, God's mercy, God's forgiveness. So the only way the psalmist was going to be able to overcome their sins was God forgiving them and showing mercy on them, but then also teaching them. And Psalm 26:12, Margaret.
My foot standeth in an even place. In the congregations will I bless the Lord.
I thought this one was maybe a little more read between the lines. But what did we think? What does this say about how they were going to be able to overcome sin? I think there is something there. It's just you have to look for it maybe.
We talk a lot about stronger together, and we also talk about the importance of gathering together and what we gain from being associated with people of like minds.
Yeah.
And that obviously helps us to learn to and to be with people who think like we think, and that helps us then to be stronger and to learn.
Absolutely.
It also speaks to our attendance.
Yeah, so the psalmist says one of the ways I'm going to be able to overcome this is by being a part of God's people. Great.
I saw that righteous judgment comes from standing on the level place. The only thing that makes the ground level is God supporting us, because we don't stand in justice in this life. Life is unjust. But if I'm going to stand on a level place, that means I'm standing on the foundation that is God, and He has leveled the playing field.
Yeah, absolutely. And it makes me think of the other Psalms where it says, He takes me out of the pit and He puts me on the level or the high ground. So I think that's absolutely right. Okay, 39, 1 through 2. That would be you, Greg.
I said, I will guard my ways, that I may not sin with my tongue. I will guard my mouth as with a muzzle. While the wicked are in my presence, I was dumb and silent. I refrained even from good, and my sorrow was worse.
Okay, so what does this say about overcoming sin?
I can offer no defense, and I think the psalmist is saying, sit there with your mouth shut instead of trying to show how good you are. And I think if you actually read further in the psalm, I think this really supports it better in verses 8 and 9. Deliver me from all my transgressions. Make me not the reproach of the foolish. I have become dumb. I do not open my mouth because it is thou who hast done it. So my salvation doesn't come from my own defense.
Yeah, I almost saw that as a humility or, like you said, being willing to be quiet and listen. The phrase that I took away from it was the keep watch over my ways. You know, I have to watch those things. And this gets into where, obviously, there are the things that God does, but as moral free agents, we also have a responsibility too. God expects certain things of us. Okay. Well, sorry, Andrew. We didn't get through it all. So I would be ready to start lesson 4 on Sunday to keep on track. If you have any questions about the material that we didn't cover, I'd be happy to talk about that. And if I don't know, I'll direct you Andrew's way. But thank you.